days ago when we finished looking at the economy between 1945 and 1951. This is a pre-record focused on the Labour Party's policy of nationalisation. I'm going to really briefly talk you through what it actually is, how nationalisation works, what the pros are, what the cons are, to what extent nationalisation was a radical policy, whether it was a non-radical policy, and then we're going to give we're going to think about evidence supporting the argument that it was an economic success but a political failure, and vice versa. Now, nationalisation, I'm imagining you've heard of it before. The definition that I would like us to use is this, or the definition that I want you to use is this. It is the common ownership of the means of production, the means of transportation, and the means of distribution. You're going to see how terrible I am at typing. Right. You have probably heard of the means of production before. The means of production is it's a term that's coined by Marx, and it's probably not worth doing. I don't know why I'm doing that. Ignore me. I've got a better idea. So the means of production is a term coined by Karl Marx, and it basically means how stuff is made. So the process of making things using industry or technology, blah, 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 blah. So here we're talking about things like factories. The means of transportation is quite straightforward. So that would be public transport, the transportation of goods and services. And then the means of distribution includes things to do with trade. Now, common ownership means ownership by the people. But obviously, Britain in the 1940s is not a communist society, but it is a socialist society. So when we talk about common ownership, what we mean actually is this is quite a radical socialist idea, a radical socialist concept. And it's the idea that the means of production, i.e. industry, how stuff is made, is owned by the people. And we are interpreting this to mean a sort of democratic socialism, which means that the means of production, the means of transportation, and the means of distribution are taken under state control. So we are a democratic socialist society under Labour between 1945 and 1951, which means state control over specifically the means of production. Because remember, Labour between 45 and 51 is openly a socialist government. They're not closeted socialists. Now, in terms of where we see the Labour Party committing itself to nationalisation, the Labour Party has committed itself to nationalisation since the 1918 Labour Party constitution. So nationalisation has been part of Labour Party core ideology since the drawing up of the 1918 Labour Party constitution. And we have a real commitment to nationalisation in the 1945 manifesto. And remember that the manifesto of 1945, the motto is "Let us face the future." It's this very hopeful, forward-facing, and the emphasis on us really is indicative of that increased state control. And obviously, nationalisation makes sense in a government that is going to advocate for increased state control over multiple different things. It's going to advocate for increased state control over education, healthcare, but also the means of production, the means of transportation. It's also going to include nationalisation of things like banking and the financial sector and stuff like that. Now, in terms of what actually is nationalised, sorry, I was clapping my hands then, I don't know why. It's this, basically. I would like you to, as much as you feasibly can, to commit some of this to memory. What I really, really need you to remember is that iron and steel are nationalised right at the death of the 45 to 51 Labour government. The nationalisation of iron and steel is deeply controversial, as we'll look at when we look at what the Conservatives are getting up to between 45 and 51, and also the 1950 and 1951 elections. The nationalisation of iron and steel is so deeply controversial that it's basically immediately undone. But the things that are nationalised first is the Bank of England, civil aviation. So civil aviation meaning like civilian planes. Um, so that's not planes being used for trade, that's planes being used to take people from A to B. We also have the nationalisation of the coal industry, transport, electricity, gas, etc., etc. So I would like you, I mean, it would be fantastic if you can remember the specific years of different industries and when they're nationalised. But I need you to remember that the Bank of England and coal are nationalised very early on. And I need you to remember that iron and steel are nationalised much, much later. So 1951. And actually, that does play a part in the bringing down of the Labour government. Now, in terms of what actually is brought under state control, I'm just going to make you a list. So 20% of the economy is nationalised, and that includes coal, gas, electricity. Whoa, what spelling is that? Cable and wireless. So that's like radios. The Bank of England, civil aviation. So I've already explained what that is. Iron, steel, and transport. So it is a huge amount of stuff, basically, that is nationalised by the government. Remember, common ownership, state control, democratic socialism. We're nationalising the means of production. So coal, steel, iron, blah, 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 blah. We're nationalising transportation, so literally transportation. And then we're nationalising the means of distribution. So that would include transportation, but also electricity and gas and stuff like that. And yes. Now, when we're thinking about arguments that are in support of nationalisation, I would argue that the biggest positive to implementing a policy of nationalisation is the dismantling of what you call natural monopolies. So a monopoly is I'll give you a good I'll try and think of a good definition. A monopoly is a single company or corporation that controls the entire production of one specific industry. So you might have, for example, a single corporation that completely dominates the coal industry. You might have a specific corporation that completely dominates transport. Nationalisation dismantles those monopolies. It prevents those private companies, those private corporations, from being exploitative and from profiteering, because now the things that we see being nationalised are not being run for private profit. The state, in theory, has nothing to gain from profiteering, and any money that the state did make would be rerouted back into the economy anyway. So the dismantling of natural monopolies prevents individual companies from being exploitative and from profiteering. So industry isn't, or the specific industry, let's say 20% of the British economy is no longer being run for private profit. It also, the other reason that we see monopolies developing is because of the highly specialist nature of some of these industries. So specialist industries, so you're thinking coal, steel, iron, etc., are very expensive to run. The average person cannot afford a coal mine, right? Or the average person cannot afford to have the technology that is necessary to get iron ore out of the ground and then process it into whatever iron actually is and whatever process it goes through. I have no idea. I have no idea about metallurgy. I don't know about mining. I've barely even played Minecraft, so I have no idea. But basically, because the industries are so specialist, because they're very expensive, This then sees the creation of monopolies because these corporations can own a coal mine, they can afford the specialist technology, and then they end up shutting everybody out. The other problem is monopolies set their own prices, which again can be exploitative and can make domestically produced items, or items using domestic natural resources, incredibly expensive. So with nationalisation, we see, so when things are under state control, prices can be reasonable. And like I say, industry is not run for personal gain and private profit. There is no incentive for profit, so no profiteering. And the services are actually run for the public good instead of profit. So there's an emphasis on, is this service actually functioning? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? Is it benefiting the population? Instead of, is it lining the pockets of the CEO with the most amount of money humanly possible? Who gives a damn if the actual service doesn't work? So services are run for public good instead of for profit. So you can see here, obviously, I hinting quite strongly at it. This is a very socialist left-wing policy. This is, again, going back to our definition of nationalisation, common ownership of the means of production. The means of production, things aren't being run for private profit, things are being run for the betterment of society, so services are run for public good. This does mean actually that there is a increased access to things like gas and electricity. So in very, what the heck? I really can't spell. I mean, to be fair, it's like 8:20 and I am really tired. As you can see, 8:20 on a Friday, and I'm doing this for you. Aren't you lucky? Anyway, so under private companies, you wouldn't have rural areas that have a decent supply to things like wireless or gas, electricity, and stuff like that. So in rural Scotland and Wales, they don't have reliable access to wireless, electricity, gas, because the incentive for the private companies just wasn't there because there wasn't enough demand and therefore not enough profit. But when the state takes control, they can then give these rural areas access to these key resources because, again, these companies aren't being run for profit, they're being run for the betterment of human society or for the betterment of British society. So state control means rural areas have increased access to things like wireless, gas, electricity, which means that society is becoming more modern, especially in rural areas. This is great. This improves people's quality of life. Now, in terms of the actual logistics of nationalisation and how that benefits industrial production, we have a significant expansion of the production of coal. So the production of coal increases significantly. And we also have the implementation of health and safety legislation. So it's safer to work in traditionally dangerous industries because, again, we're not being run for private profit anymore. The private companies would skimp on things to keep people safe because it was too expensive, but that isn't a problem anymore because it's being run by the government, and the government actually does have a vested interest in making sure that, you know, people's hands aren't being smushed in coal mines or people's faces aren't getting accidentally whacked off with a pickaxe and stuff like that. So health and safety legislation does actually make it a lot safer, basically, to work in nationalised industries. So these are all the positives that I can think of. I've probably forgotten something, but I think really the big picture here is we've got the dismantling of monopolies, the prevention of profiteering. The state improves like electrification to rural areas. People have access to electricity and gas in areas that they previously didn't. And also we have the production of coal is increasing significantly, and health and safety legislation gets a lot better. Now, in terms of the arguments against nationalisation, obviously the elephant in the room is this is blooming expensive. So private companies end up being compensated to the tune of £2.7 billion. That is a lot of money. And the taxpayer is therefore liable for two things. So the taxpayer is liable for compensating private companies whose industries are taken over by the state. But the taxpayer is also liable for unproductive and inefficient, I can't spell that, industries. Now, as much as coal production does increase significantly, coal is a notoriously inefficient industry. The coal industry in Britain has always been really problematic. The other industry that's been really problematic and oh, my laptop's dying. Right, give me 1 second. I just need to plug it in. And I don't actually know if I've got the charger up here. Oh, I do. Here it is. 1 second. Right. The other industry that is really unproductive is transport. So the coal industry and transport are inefficient and very expensive to run. These two industries cause a really big problem in 1947. So look, transport is nationalised in 1948 as a consequence of the terrible winter of 46 and 47, but coal is nationalised during the horrible deep freeze of the winter of 1947, when coal production basically grinds to a halt, industrial production grinds to a halt. This is really bad for the government. It's so bafflingly expensive. And these are the major reasons or the major arguments against nationalisation. You also have the alienation of, I don't know what to call them because it's not really middle class. I suppose it's the super wealthy industrial giants who have lost their factories and coal mines, etc., etc. These people, to be honest, aren't voting Labour anyway. The vast majority of people who own a coal mine are not going to be voting for the socialist Labour government. Right. In terms of what evidence we have to suggest that nationalisation is a radical policy, then, is that state ownership of many industries lasts well into the 1980s. And who do we have to thank for the privatisation of basically every single tiny little thing? Margaret Blooming Thatcher, Maggie Thatcher, Milk Snatcher. I'm clapping again. Apparently I clap a lot at 8:30 at night. And what? Oh, hang on. I don't want that double space. What is also interesting is that the Tory government in the 1950s doesn't undo much of the nationalisation project of the Labour government that preceded them at all, really. There is actually a huge amount of continuity between the Tory economy between 51 and 57 and the Labour economy of 45 to 51, but we'll talk about that. The other thing that suggests that not the welfare state, I'm about to talk about the welfare state. The other thing that suggests that nationalisation is actually quite a radical policy is it pushes Britain towards this idea of collectivism. So along with the welfare state, so talking the NHS, the benefit system, etc., etc., people are actually taking collective responsibility for each other. So we've got redistributive taxation policies. We have the socialist policy of nationalisation. You've got socialist healthcare. We are being pushed further and further towards collectivism. The other idea that suggests that we now have or that the policy of nationalisation is radical is that Britain now has what's called a mixed economy. So economists, you'll know what this means, but basically it's where the economy is made up of both private and nationalized industries. So remember, 20% of the economy is state run, 80% of the economy is private run. So we cannot say that Britain is a totally 100% capitalist society anymore. We have taken a significant step towards socialism. Now, the evidence that we have to suggest that actually the nationalisation programme really isn't that radical is that before 1945, we've already got precedent for state control over certain industries. So, blimmin' double spaced. We see that with things like, for example, 1914 Dora, the requisition of factories in World War One and World War Two. And as much as I've said that nationalisation is a socialist policy, the true socialist agenda in the UK is pushing for worker controlled industry, which just doesn't happen. So the socialist dream of worker controlled industry just does not happen. And I suppose if we're looking at this, I've just made a big deal about the fact that Britain now has a mixed economy. We're not 100% capitalist anymore. It's a significant step towards socialism. But really, 20% of the economy isn't that much, really. Still, the vast majority. Why is caps lock not working? Vast majority of industry is privately owned. I can't spell, and I'm going to lose the plot. Now, I'm thinking I might talk you through economic success and political failure another time, because this actually could make quite a nice essay plan. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. So, nationalisation, you could easily get a source question about this. I will try and I'll try and dig out some sources on this, because there's never been a source question before, but there's also an exam question that I want to set you, which I will do after we've looked at the establishment of the welfare state, which is the British government 45 to 51 completely changed the role of the state in Britain. How far do you agree? And that is where you would talk about the establishment of the welfare state and the policy of nationalisation. So I really, really need you to make sure that you know this inside out. In a couple of days, I'm going to set you a carousel quiz specifically about nationalisation, because I need to check that you have done it. Hopefully that made sense. Hopefully I didn't waffle too much. I am really tired. I'm going to go now. Have a lovely rest of your day.